I love what you had to say about local news and local newspapers. And ironically enough, the local community health center, the local hospitals all get covered when you have robust local newspapers. So people would know where to get a vaccine. They'd know about local health. But the other side of it is the economics of local newspaper is just, my own background, I worked at my local newspaper when I was a kid. My father was a linotype operator at my local newspaper for 43 years. So I've studied newspapers really my whole life. And it is frustrating. And I've never really thought about it. The impact, I think about the impact on a democracy and in government. And you're right, governments become more corrupt. There's no local reporter watching to see what people do. Everything you said was beautiful and right on the money. I never really thought about it in terms of health disparity. So I thought that was excellent. But the question is, what can we do? What can we put in a statement that deals with the economics of local newspapers? In fact, local newspapers are dying in the United States. And I don't see any way to turn it around. They're being, you don't have local ownership anymore. I mean, I've studied a lot about it. Part of it, you don't have local ownership. How do you stop these large chains from buying up newspapers? Because that's what happens. They buy up newspapers and they immediately start cutting and great newspapers just get cut. I don't know what the answer is in terms of economically how we can support it.
And there are news economists who study this to a much greater depth than I do. But I think the business model of news has been broken for a really long time. I think it was treated as a commodity more than a public good. And so when the internet came along, it felt like the internet broke local news when actually I think it was going to fail long before that. But there are alternative models and we're seeing some of them, whether it comes to really community-based and citizen journalism that's supported, whether it's by local philanthropists, not-for-profit news. There are alternate models that I think we need to investigate, given we keep trying to put a Band-Aid on a model that clearly was not designed to succeed. So I think instead of that, we need to lean into those alternative models. But there are ways to build robust local news. And I hope that we can see that as an antidote. Like I said, the local news can serve as an immune system to a democracy.
Thank you.
We have time for about 2 or 3 more comments. Next is Jane.
I'll just be really quick, which is kind of an answer to both of those. At the moment, in Ireland, we're just going through a process looking at local news. I also used to be a journalist, and we're part of that. But one of the things that we're looking at there is, instead of going back to the local newspapers, is going even smaller into community. And then this obviously doesn't work in America because you don't have it, but in lots of parts of Europe, there's a public sector broadcasting where people pay some money towards a license fee.
Oh, we do have that in the US.
Okay,
Yes.
so what we're talking about is actually using some of the license fee to actually support journalism in kind of micro communities and having that, organized in a central media commission. And there's legislation going in to support that.
Yeah, well, we don't have exactly that, but we have, alternative. I'm thinking about public radio and public television. But yeah.
Justin?
Oh, did Marcella?
Oh, Marcel.
Yeah. Thank you, Sima. That was true and just and beautiful. So fantastic. Very brief question. How much do you think the dark history of medical abuse, especially in the Western countries, on minoritized populations, the syphilis experiments, the Nazi doctors, beautifully written by Lifton. I wonder if you could, how much does, in your opinion, that factor in the theorized hesitancy of minoritized populations? So is it that we're living in deserts of all kinds, or is it that the orientation to start with is a very skeptical orientation for very, very good reasons?
Yeah, it's both of those things. You talk to 6 people who are on various levels of the vaccine hesitancy spectrum, and you may get 6 very different reasons as to why they're specifically hesitant about the COVID vaccine. Sometimes some Black Americans especially will cite the Tuskegee study. Just a few years ago, there was a really bad outbreak of tuberculosis in Alabama. And I remember my public health colleagues at CDC kind of wringing their hands, being so frustrated. Oh, we're offering cash incentives to come get tested for TB. We're offering cash incentives to come get an X-ray, to get vaccinated, and people weren't coming forward. All you have to do is look on Google Maps. It's like an hour-and-a-half drive from where Tuskegee happened. And to think that that legacy wouldn't still persist, we know it does, but it's also not just a historical legacy. Black people in America are still less likely to have their pain believed. They're less likely to get proper pain treatment. Black women are like 4 times more likely in the US to die in childbirth or shortly after. So those legacies continue, and they massively impact the trust or the distrust between some communities and medical establishment. The same is true for journalism. When I tell my family, you should get vaccinated, here's a really good New York Times article about how safe and effective the new vaccines are, in the back of my mind, I know as a journalist, there are significant analyses that show the New York Times is really Islamophobic. It frames Islam in quite negative ways. There was an analysis that showed in the coverage of a trial, it's 700% more likely to list the faith of a Muslim criminal than a Christian criminal. And so I'm sending my family a New York Times article about vaccine, knowing that that reporting colors their belief, you know, in the reporting of the media in general. So we have to acknowledge and atone for these histories, but also the current reporting. And National Geographic did it. Los Angeles Times recently apologized for its racist coverage over history, for backing internment camps of the Japanese, you know. So I think it's a really important way to build trust, to do that, as opposed to just believers. Believe what's in the press, believe what your doctor says, believe what the government says. Actually, all of these institutions have acted egregiously. Let's consider that before we ask people to just give us their blind trust.
One more. Oh, I'm sorry, pardon me.
No, after.
Very quickly.
So my question is, yeah. My question is completely different about your problem, American problem. But what is your impression about the Afghanistan to come the situation today?
Oh gosh, we could say lots about that. Just to make it relevant to the discussion, I will say, for example.
Yeah, it's a question of truth also.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And as a Muslim person, and also as a person who works for cable news, I see the analysis or the lack of analysis on the reporting on the current situation, which often erases 20, 30 years of history that led to where we are. And it's one thing that makes me think, is anyone getting smarter watching cable news? I really worry about that. And I worry about the fact that you can watch this as just a piece of breaking news, and breaking, everything is always breaking, without the context of how we got here, without an analysis of why America intervened, how the people that became the Taliban actually took US money to do so, and actually took US military weapons to, you know, that analysis is often missing. And that's a problem, not just in coverage of Afghanistan, but in so many other issues too.
Thank you.
Very quickly, to build on that, perhaps this isn't your area of research, but what are the local news dynamics in other parts of the world, perhaps in non-Western or developing countries? And as we think about the countermeasures going here, are the negative effects of news deserts, do they work the same across national contexts? All those negative effects listed, especially in non-Western. Not that you have to, yeah.
No, I can only speak to Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, because during the Ebola epidemic, I was analyzing the coverage there. It was many of the same issues. In fact, there were really well-respected legacy newspapers in Liberia that printed headlines that were completely conspiratorial, completely falsified about Ebola. And then what you had is a government trying to damp down on the press in a way that wasn't safe or effective either. We need freedom of press still, but we need measures to make sure that what's being reported is accurate. What I did find really interesting from studying the West African response to the epidemic was that some of the interventions that worked in terms of correcting misinformation and disinformation were not that technologically sophisticated, but really effective. Oh, you've heard a myth about Ebola, or you heard the eating raw onions cures Ebola. text what you've heard to this number, you'll get an SMS back that tells you whether it's correct or not. So some of those interventions are really
Yeah,
interesting.
That's fantastic.
One more question so we can get back on time. Max?
Thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you also for sharing the work that you have in progress. I feel as though there's so many lines of inquiry that can emanate from that. From Justin's question, the proliferation of radio in some of these places could be really fascinating. But the question I wanted to ask was further along the lines of what Marcelo had pointed to, that in your work, this is work in progress, as I understand it, the newspaper deserts and health deserts, are you going to be looking for sensitivities around race and gender in terms of these? And have you found anything preliminarily yet?
Not yet, but I think that has to be an essential part of it. And I haven't seen that done yet. And part of the reason why I feel like we're being really slow is because we're also redefining what it means to be in a medical desert. We don't think that some of the existing definitions of, it means you're 60 miles from a doctor is sufficient. You could live 2 miles from a doctor and still face significant barriers to access, whether that's financial or language or transport or whatever it is. So, but that's definitely something we plan to look into. There was some fantastic analysis from the University of Chicago last year that looked at the Fox News effect, but not just that. It looked so specifically at whether you were likely to wear a mask, wash your hands more, adhere to quarantine regulations, depending on which anchor you watched on Fox, and whether that anchor thought COVID was a hoax this time last year or thought it was serious. So there's some fascinating, quite granular analysis about what impact media has on our behaviors. But what you're mentioning is certainly something we want to look into.
That's great. That's great.
Okay,
Forward to it.
we'll move to the next. Thank